which again, if you're in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, it is found on page 144. If you're in any other Chumash, it's in the middle of chapter 28 of Bereshit. Middle of Bereshit, the Genesis chapter 28. So again, a blockbuster Torah portion packed with amazing drama, twists and turns, excitement, and of course, life lessons that are applicable to each and every one of us, each and every day of our lives. And we always have to remember that when we study Torah. Torah is not Torah is much more than a history book. It's a book of life lessons and guidance and instruction. The word Torah means hora'ah, teacher. So we always have to learn the Torah with an eye of how can we apply these lessons to our daily lives. So the opening story of the Torah portion is the famous story of Jacob's ladder. There's a lot of art pieces that have been created around Jacob's ladder. And it's this magnificent dream that Jacob has. Now, let's just remember what's transpiring in the life of Jacob. Jacob is fleeing from his brother Esau, who wants to kill him because he took his blessings. Now, he had taken the blessings because he had purchased the birthright and he was deserving of those blessings. But Esau feels cheated. As he says to his father, he tricked me twice. First, he got me to sell the birthright for a bowl of soup. And now he took my firstborn blessings. But now that he followed his mother's advice to take the blessings, because his mother Rebecca insisted that the blessings had to go to him and his future descendants, his brother says, okay. When Esau learns that Jacob took his blessings, he says, when my father dies, I'm going to take revenge and I'll kill my brother. So Rebecca says to her son Jacob, pack up and run away to the house of my brother Laban in Haran and stay there till the wrath, the anger of your brother subsides. So now he's journeying from his house in Israel, Canaan, the home of his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. He's a single man, Jacob, and he is heading towards Haran, where he will live with his uncle Laban. And on the way, he goes to sleep, and he has this famous dream. And what is the dream? The dream is a ladder. The ladder spans from the earth all the way up to the heavens. And what does he see on the ladder? He sees angels, olim v'yordimbo. Angels are going up and coming down the ladder. Angels going up and down the ladder. And in the dream, God appears to Jacob and makes the most magnificent promises to Jacob. He says, I am the God of your ancestors, Abram and Isaac. And I will go with you. I will watch over you. And God says to him, this land that you're sleeping on, because he was still in the land of Israel, I will give it to you and your descendants, your children, just like I promised to your forefathers, Abram and Isaac. This will go to the children of Israel. And I will be with you on this journey. I will watch over you. I will protect you. I will return you in peace to your father's house, because obviously he's fearful of his brother Esau. And I will not forsake you until I perform everything that I promised you. So he gets this very reassuring revelation from God in his dream, accompanied by the image of the ladder with the angels going up and down. And Jacob wakes up from this dream and says the following. He says, indeed, behold, God is in this place, and I did not know it. And he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the abode of God, and this is the gateway to heavens. And he gets up and he takes the stone that he slept on, he puts it up as a monument, and he pours oil on it, and he says, I'm going to name this place Bet El, the house of God. And he makes a vow that when God fulfills this promise and will be with me and protect me and return me in peace to my father's home, then this stone will be a monument for the house of God, and everything God gives me, I will give tithes, I will give charity. So there are a lot of dreams in the book of Bereshit, but what is the meaning of this dream? So the literal explanation that Rashi says is that whenever a person journeys in life, we have guardian angels. We don't always see our guardian angels, but we actually have guardian angels. I'll tell you a funny story. We had a member of our shul many years ago. He's made aliyah since then. His name is Benjamin Wall. And he once came to shul, and he was on a construction site because he was building his home, and something fell and like missed him by an inch. He had just moved out of the way, and it could have been, God forbid, life-threatening, that injury had that object fallen on him. And he literally said to me, Rabbi, I need to make the Gomel blessing to thank God for sparing my life, because that could have been fatal. And then he said, I want to give Kiddush. I want to be a sponsor of the Kiddush this week in honor of God's protection of me. And that's what he did. He sponsored the Kiddush. We put his name in the bulletin. And then, as the custom is upon each synagogue, when someone sponsors a Kiddush, they get to speak. And he got up and he told the story and how grateful he is to God. And then he said, I'm dedicating this Kiddush in honor of my guardian angel that was watching over me. So there is a concept of guardian angels. As a matter of fact, Jacob, this very Jacob that we're reading about, on his deathbed, he's going to bless his children and his grandchildren, Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh. And the blessing he gives his grandchildren, he says, Hamalach hagoel oti mikol ra. The angel, the guardian angel who protected me, who was my guardian, and protected me and safeguarded me from all evil, may this guardian angel be a blessing for my children and my grandchildren. So Jacob recognizes that he had a special angel watching over him. So Rashi says something very interesting. Rashi says that, just like, different people have different jobs and different posts and different positions, angels have different positions. And Rashi says that angels, there are one set of angels that only operate in the land of Israel. And then there are angels that operate outside of Israel, because we know Israel has a higher level of holiness than outside of Israel. So Jacob is about to leave the land of Israel. So the angels that were accompanying him on the journey, protecting him up until now, cannot go outside of Israel. So therefore they were ascending on the ladder, meaning returning to the heavens. And new angels were coming down the ladder to accompany him outside of Israel. Because Rashi says the angels of Israel don't venture outside of Israel. And that's how Rashi explains. Rashi's question is the angels should have been coming down and going up, because angels originate in heaven. Why is it angels were going up and coming down? Because the angels that were with him in Israel were returning to heaven, and new angels were coming down. So that's the simple meaning. But there's a very, deeper explanation to this. When it says that Jacob arrived in this place, which was called Luz, but he renamed it Bethel, it says Vayifka b'makom. Now, literally, it means he encountered the place. But our rabbis tells us a much deeper explanation to this. We know that one of the names of God has many names. One of the names of God is Makom. The place you hear the name Makom means the place. God is the space of the world. He fills space. When you go to a mourner's home, God forbid, for a shiva, there's a greeting or a comfort that we give to the mourners. And what do we say? Hamakom, Almighty God, but we use the name Makom, should comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. So one of the names of God is Makom. Now, Vayifka b'makom can mean he encountered the place, or it can mean he encountered God. That Jacob encountered God, which means he prayed. Now it was nighttime, the sun had set. Until today, we know that Jacob is the one, three patriarchs instituted the three prayers: Abraham morning, Isaac afternoon prayers, Mincha, and Jacob instituted the evening prayer. Where right here he encountered God, he prayed to God. And by the way, this is very symbolic. Why is Jacob the one who instituted the nighttime prayer? Because from all the patriarchs, who had the most tumultuous, difficult, challenging life? It was Jacob. Jacob had quarrels with his brother Esav from the womb. Then he had to run away from his brother Esav. Then he has to deal with Laban in this week's Torah portion, all of his challenges with his father-in-law. And then at the end of his life, he has to deal with the abduction of his son Joseph, who was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. So Jacob represents the forefather who experienced the nighttime, meaning the dark times, the struggling, harsh periods. Incidentally, we are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But which patriarch are we most connected to? Jacob. Because Jacob in next week's Torah portion is going to wrestle with an angel, and he's going to get a new name, and he's going to be called Yisroel. And what are we called? B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. Why are we most aligned with Jacob? Because again, Jacob represents the man of faith in the midst of fire. In other words, he goes through the most struggles, but he maintains his faith in God, and he perseveres, and he shows tremendous resilience and fortitude. And Jacob is always contending with one struggle or challenge or the other, but he always prevails. And that's really the collective story of the Jewish people for thousands of years, always fraught with tremendous obstacles and challenges as Jews. Anti-Semitism throughout all the ages and all the terrible atrocities that were perpetrated against the Jews. But like Jacob, we wrestle with the angels. We don't become defeated. We don't capitulate. We don't throw in the towel. We don't give up. We persevere. So we're the children of Jacob. So Jacob prays the nighttime prayer, which is Arvit, the evening prayer, represented this idea of faith during the darkness. So Vayifka b'makom means he encountered God as well. And therefore, our rabbis say that the ladder, one of the metaphors of Jacob's ladder, is the story of the Jewish people. What is the story of the Jewish people? Like the ladder, we are bridging heaven and earth. The whole goal of Judaism is to build a bridge or a ladder between heaven and earth. And like the ladder that starts on the ground, we rise up. We climb the ladder to higher and higher, greater spiritual heights. More specifically, our rabbis say it refers to prayer. Every day when you come to pray, whether at home or in the synagogue, it's like climbing a ladder. You start on the ground, but then as you pray, you raise yourself up higher and higher in your connection to Hashem. And the idea of angels going up and down is the prayers that go up through our prayers. We create angels that become our emissaries, our advocates in heaven, and they bring back down the blessings, the answers to our prayers, the inspiration. So the metaphor of the Jacob's ladder is very specifically prayer, but collectively it's the idea of Judaism, of creating this connection between heaven and earth. It's not like we're on earth and spirituality and God is in heaven. No, we actually have a bridge that we can climb up, that we could climb this ladder and connect with spirituality. And to go a little further in this analogy, just like on a ladder, it's not an escalator and it's not an elevator. It doesn't just go straight to the top. You have to climb one rung after another, and it takes effort. So too in Judaism, to attain higher and higher, greater spiritual heights, you have to raise yourself up one level at a time. And it's interesting that we always say that in Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov once said to his students, if you have two people on a ladder, one person's on the 5th rung and the other person's on the 10th rung, who's higher on the ladder? So the student said, well, obviously the person on the 10th rung is higher than the person on the 5th rung. And the Baal Shem Tov said, not necessarily, he said, if the person on the 10th rung is climbing down the ladder, and the person on the 5th rung is climbing up the ladder, then the person on the 5th rung is higher than the person on the 10th rung. In other words, it's not only where you are on the rung of Judaism, it's a question in which direction you're going. There are people who are born into very religious homes, and unfortunately, they're going down the ladder. They're becoming less observant, less religious, less connected to Torah and mitzvot. And then there are people who are born with no Jewish background. They're on the bottom of the ladder, but they're climbing higher and higher. So even though one person may be more knowledgeable and more observant, they're going down the ladder versus someone else going up the ladder. It's like if I showed you two stocks today, and one is worth $10 and one is worth $5, but I told you the stock that's worth $10 is going down every day. It's crashing. The other one is building and climbing. The company is getting stronger and stronger. You're going to want the $5. If I say, okay, you can have 100 shares of either one, you'd much rather have 100 shares than the $5 stock because the company is getting better and stronger. The other one's going downhill. The same thing with God. God is not as interested in where we are on the ladder as opposed to which direction we're heading. Are we growing? Are we gaining ground? Are we improving? Are we advancing in our personal lives, in our Yiddishkeit, in our observance of mitzvot? Or are we declining, God forbid? And that's what God wants more than anything else. And that's, again, the metaphor of the ladder, climbing up the ladder. Just to take one other nuanced idea of this ladder is, when you're on a rung of a ladder, you have 2 feet planted on the rung, right? But in order to climb higher, what do you have to do on a ladder? You have to release 1 foot to go higher, right? Now, for that moment, when you take 1 foot off the ladder, your position on the rung of the ladder has now become weakened, right? Because you're more vulnerable. You only have 1 foot connecting you to the ladder, not 2. Your position is not as firm. But in order to get to the next rung, you have to be willing to risk, so to speak, or put yourself in a vulnerable position to make that effort to climb higher. So it's a very good metaphor for life, that sometimes when you want to advance, before you can advance, in the process of advancing, you have to be willing to make yourself more vulnerable. By removing one of the legs from the ladder in order to climb higher, you weaken your position on the ladder. But any growth, and it's not only in spiritual matters, it's in material things as well. In order to take a step forward, you have to be willing to take a risk. Sometimes people are afraid to make changes in their life. They're afraid, they say, at least I'm on a lower rung, but at least I got my feet firmly planted here. If I start making movements, who knows? I may, fall off the ladder, so to speak. But part of growth means that we're not afraid to make changes and improvements in our lives, even if it challenges or shakes up the equilibrium and the security that we have in this position. We're willing to advance, even if it, means that we may, because of exposing ourselves to vulnerability, and we may somehow lose our balance in some way. But we're willing to do that in order to grow. I'll give you another metaphor from a lobster that I once heard from Rabbi Abraham Twersky. He said, lobsters, what could you learn from a lobster? We're not allowed to eat lobster as Jews. So what could we learn from a lobster? So he said that lobsters, apparently, when they're in the water, they're born and they have a very, very hard shell. Now, how do their bodies grow if they have a very hard shell? So he says the body grows and grows, and then it starts to feel constrained and suffocating and restricted by the shell. So what does it do? It sheds its shell, the lobster, and at that point, it grows a larger shell. Now, he said the reason God created the lobster with a hard shell is to protect it from predators. Now, when the lobster wants to grow, it has to shed its shell. When it sheds its shell, it makes itself vulnerable to attack. But it's willing to take that risk in order to grow a larger body and a larger shell. And he says the metaphor in all of our lives is that sometimes we feel constrained, stifled, suffocating spiritually or emotionally because we're not happy. Just like sometimes if we need a new pair of shoes because we've outgrown our shoes, sometimes we grow beyond what our physical body is able to, meaning our spiritual makeup and composition is growing. And we have to be willing to shed our old persona and position to advance and grow, even if it means we're making ourselves vulnerable in the process. So the whole idea of the ladder is a spiritual climb. And I'll just tell you a quick story. There's a story that a group of college kids back in the day came to New York on spring break. And it was in the early years, maybe the 60s or the 70s. And one of them had a religious relative who lived in Crown Heights, a Chabad fellow. He said, while you're in New York City, they were coming from some out of town, why don't you go have an audience with the Lubavitcher Rebbe? And I guess in those days, you were able to get an audience with the Rebbe. So they arranged for these college kids to come to 770 Stabaka and talk to the Rebbe. And there's actually a recording of the conversation that lasted a few hours. They asked, these were very bright kids. They asked the Rebbe a lot of questions about theology, about God, about ethics, morals, Judaism, about the Hasidic movement and everything else. Now, these kids were not observant kids. And at the end of the meeting, one of the kids said to the Rebbe, Rebbe, I have a question for you. And the Rebbe said, sure, what's your question? He says, we're not observant Jews. We don't eat kosher. We don't keep Shabbos. And we want to know, how do you view us? Do you view us as good Jews or not? Do you see us as good Jews, even though we're not observant? And the Rebbe's answer was the following. The Rebbe said, I'm sure you know the story of Jacob's ladder from this week's Torah portion. And the Rebbe said the whole idea of Judaism is that you have to be climbing higher and higher in your spiritual growth, just like physically. Human nature is nobody likes to stay in the same place. You have to grow physically, right? You have to advance, not just your body, but in life. People want to get better, right? You start your career at age 23, you have a job, you want to get to the next level, a promotion, you want to grow, if you start a business, you want it to advance, you don't want to stay in one place. You want to grow in every area of life. Same thing spiritually. We should always want to grow. We shouldn't be satisfied with the Judaism that we've been practicing 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. We have to get better. So the Rebbe said that the whole idea of Jacob's ladder is they have to climb higher and higher. And the Rebbe said, since you guys are on spring break and you took a night off from spring break that you could have been having a good time in Manhattan somewhere at a party, and you came to Brooklyn to meet with a rabbi to talk about Judaism and answer questions about God and things of that nature, that shows me that you're climbing up the ladder. You're trying to get better. And since you're trying to grow and get better, that means you're good Jews. Because good Jews doesn't mean how religious you are. It means that you're trying to improve. So that's the whole idea of Jacob's ladder. Now, when Jacob wakes up, he says the following. He says, indeed, God is in this place, and I did not know it. The question is, what do you mean he didn't know that God is in this place? I mean, every Jew knows that God is everywhere in the world. So what does Jacob mean when he wakes up from his dream and he says, oh, God is in this place and I did not know it? How could he not have known that God is in this place? And one of the beautiful answers is as follows. In Hebrew, he's saying as follows. God is in this place, va'anochi, and the I. Anochi means I did not know it, but you could also read it va'anochi. The I, the ego, I did not know. In other words, how did I realize and experience God? God is everywhere. So why is it that sometimes we experience God and sometimes we don't experience God? Why is it sometimes we feel the presence of God and sometimes we don't feel the presence of God? And the answer is that if we are filled with our own ego, our own sense of self, we don't let God into our life. You know the story, the Kotzker Rebbe asked his students, where is God? And they said, well, God is everywhere. And he said, no, God is only where you allow him to enter. So God could be everywhere, but at the same time not be present in your life because you don't allow him in. Why? Because you're filled with yourself. So Jacob's running from his brother. He's overcome with worries and fears, and he's so consumed with what is on his mind that he doesn't realize God is with him. He forgets that God is watching over him in this very, difficult moment of his life. So only when he went to sleep and he has this vision, he says, he wakes up, he says, I didn't realize, only when I forgot my eye I negated my sense of self for a moment, then I recognize that God is with us. And that's part of the idea of prayer. Talk about the idea of prayer, but one of the ideas of prayer is to take a moment from our day, especially the afternoon prayer, but morning and evening as well, to stop thinking about ourselves. Because all day long we're thinking about what I need to do, what I need to accomplish, what do I, our own thoughts and feelings. And to take a period of time to put ourselves to the side and think about God, and that God is present and God is here, and be aware, like Jacob, oh, I forgot. Sometimes I'm so consumed with my worries, whatever they could be, financial worries, other headaches or struggles or problems, whatever it may be, that I'm so worried about that I forget the most important thing. Hashem is with me. And if Hashem is with me, I should not fear. I should have confidence. I should have trust. Everything's going to be good. So that's a very important part of prayer, of limiting your ego or restricting and confining your ego to make space for Hashem. We may not be able to do it constantly, but at least during the moments of prayer, to be able to remember that Hashem is with us at all times. That's very important. Now, one other point that many of the commentaries talk about is that Jacob is going to have two dreams in this week's Torah portion. One is the dream here with the ladder and the angels going up and down. But then later, fast forward the rest of the Torah portion, I think you know what this week's Torah portion is all about. He gets to the house of Laban. Here's the 60-second summary of this week's Torah portion. He gets to the house of his uncle Laban. He meets Rachel at the well, and he instantly falls in love with her. And he hugs her and kisses her, actually. And then he comes home to the house. Rachel, of course, is the daughter of his uncle, his first cousin. And then he comes home and he says to his future father-in-law, Laban, I would like to marry your daughter, Rachel. Can I have her hand in marriage? And Laban says, yes, on one condition, not such a small condition. He said, I want you to work in the business for me for 7 years, free of payment. 7 years, be a shepherd for me without any salary. And in return for working for me 7 years, I'll let you marry Rachel. Well, he loves her, and he agrees to work for 7 years for his father-in-law. And he works 7 years, and the Torah says how hard he worked. And fascinatingly, I'm just going to interrupt the summary for a minute. The Torah says that the 7 years felt like just a few days because he loved her so much. And the commentators say, whoa, what's going on here? Usually if you love somebody so much and I tell you got to wait 7 years to marry them, it seems like an eternity. Like every day feels like a month. Every month feels like a year. Every year feels like a decade. Like how could the Torah say that because Jacob loved her so much, the 7 years felt like a few days? And the answer actually is, the rabbis say that it doesn't say, listen to the verse. It says, it felt like a few days because he loved her and his love for her. You see, when we think of love, sometimes we think about self-love. In other words, I love being with this person, so I can't wait another minute. But it's about your love for yourself, not your love for that person. Jacob loved her and realized what a blessing it would be for his life to be married to Rachel and start a family in the 12 tribes of Israel. So he said, if I have to pay the price of 7 years to marry such a woman, it's worth it. And therefore, it didn't feel like such a long time. The famous parable, I'm sure I've shared it before, but it's the parable given by, not by the Dubna Maggid, it's given by, I'm forgetting who gives the analogy. But anyways, the analogy is that a guy walks into a restaurant and the waiter says, what would you like to eat? He says, do you have salmon? I love salmon. So you love salmon? We got plenty of salmon, no problem. He goes into the kitchen and tells the chef, the guy wants salmon. He loves salmon. And the chef, I guess this was a very fancy restaurant. They had live fish and water, took out a salmon, put it on the cutting block, clobbered it over the head, killed it, cut it up, deboned it, put up a frying pan with onions and oil, sizzling hot, and threw the fish in to make it for this guy to serve it to him. And the waiter, as he's taking out the fish to serve the customer on a plate, he says, that's a pretty nasty thing to do to a fish that you love. You just professed your love for salmon, and then you have it killed and fried up with onions and put on a plate. What the customer meant when he said he loves fish is not that he loves the fish. If you love the fish, you let it swim in the ocean. You don't eat it. He loves eating the fish. He loves enjoying the fish. Same thing, a lot of times we use the word, I love this, I love that. Well, everyone loves everything, right? You don't mean we love the thing. So you say, I love steak. You love eating steak. I love this woman. Does it mean you love the woman, or you love the feeling of being with this woman, the excitement, the pleasure, whatever it is? So Jacob's love was for her, not for himself. So therefore it felt like just a few days. But going back to the story, he works 7 years, but then we all know what happens. When it comes to wedding night, Laban tricks him and gives him the older sister Leah to marry. When he comes the next day to Laban, he says, why did you trick me? You gave me the wrong woman. I worked 7 years for Rachel, not for Leah. And Laban, who was a dishonest person, a deceptive person, says to Jacob, whoa, 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 whoa. In our town, we don't allow the younger sibling to get married before the older sibling. You have to marry the older sister first. And therefore, you have to marry Leah. And he was intimating to him, I know what you did back at home. You took your older brother's blessing, but we don't do that here. We don't let the younger go before the older. And Jacob says, but I still want to marry Rachel. He says, well, now you're going to have to work another 7 years. And that's what he has to do to marry the second sister. In those days, now today you're not allowed to marry two sisters according to the Torah, but this is before the Torah was given. But the idea is that in those days, people had multiple wives. And he ends up marrying both sisters. And it created a lot of problems in the marriage because Leah, throughout the Torah portion, feels unloved. Even worse than unloved, she feels despised in the marriage because Jacob's affection is really for Rachel. But and then on top of that, Jacob becomes very successful in his father-in-law's house, very prosperous. And now Laban starts being envious of him because his son-in-law is richer than him. And he feels like you came to my house as a refugee, so to speak, and I took you in, you married my daughters. Now you're more successful than me. And this is my wealth that you're making. And it's fascinating because we all know that on the night of the Seder, we sit down in the Haggadah, and one of the passages we say is an Aramean, meaning Laban was the Aramean, Arami. Oved Avi made our father Jacob work really hard. He overworked Jacob. And we then go on to say something very shocking. We say that Laban, the character in this week's Torah portion, the father-in-law of Jacob, was worse than Pharaoh. Now, how could he be worse than Pharaoh? So the Haggadah tells us why. Because Pharaoh only decreed death on the males, on the boys. But Laban wanted to uproot the entire Jewish nation. Why? Because he wanted to destroy Jacob, which was the nucleus for the Jewish nation, the first Jewish family. So Laban threatened all of the Jewish people. Now, we do find at the end of this week's Torah portion, Jacob has to run away from the house of Laban because Laban is so envious of him. And Laban runs after Jacob and his daughters. And God has to come in a dream to Laban and say, don't lay a hand on Jacob. Okay, because I am going to watch over him and you shall not harm him. And at the end, they make some kind of a treaty, some kind of a peace. But what's interesting is that I mentioned that there's two dreams in this Torah portion, two major dreams. First dream is Jacob is dreaming of angels. But later on, he has a dream of the sheep mounting one another to procreate, to proliferate, to make him more wealthy and successful. And when he wakes up, he says to his family, it's time to leave. we need to go back to the land of Israel. And there's so many metaphors here. But one is that when he left Israel, he had all these lofty, idealistic dreams. He saw it. What you dream about at night is what you think about during the day. So he was thinking about angels and ladders going to the heaven and spirituality. And then later, after being in the house of Laban for actually 22 years, not a short time, because he worked 7 years for each daughter, and then he had children. Now he goes to sleep at night. You know what he's dreaming about? Sheep mounting each other, having children, making more money, flock. And then he says, you know what? It's time to go back to Israel. It's time to go back home. We've been here too long. And your father-in-law is very envious of me. But the story of Laban, so the idea of dreams, what kind of dreams you have, right? And what that indicates about where you're at. And dreams don't only mean when you're sleeping. We have daydreams too. In other words, what do we dream about? What are our aspirations? What are our hopes? Do we think about lofty spiritual things, or like the second set of dreams of Jacob, thinking about the sheep, the cattle? But the whole story of Laban is really the story. Today we're talking so much about anti-Semitism because unfortunately it's becoming worse and worse here in America and around the world. It's also obviously always been terrible. But the idea is that where does anti-Semitism start? It starts in the house of Laban. Even before Pharaoh, we always say Pharaoh was the first anti-Semite. That's not till the book of Exodus, when Pharaoh wants to destroy the Jewish people and he throws the babies in the Nile. But in the Haggadah, we say there was someone worse than Pharaoh. And who's that? Laban. How could Laban be worse? Because he wanted to destroy the Jewish family before it even got going. But it's much more than just that he, wanted to destroy Jewish people. The Laban mentality is the mentality of anti-Semites till today. What do you hear from Kanye West and all these people, right? You hear the same thing that anti-Semites have been saying forever. Oh, Jews are aliens. They don't belong here. They're foreigners in our country. They are usurping our rights. They are stealing our wealth. They're becoming too successful, too wealthy, who are they to be so rich and powerful and all of that, right? Why do they look at it that way? Because they don't feel we have any rights. They feel like you're Jews. You should be lucky we even let you live here in our country. Chutzpah, you're going to become rich and successful, and the money you're making is my money. I'm supposed to have that money, right? That mentality that the Jew took something away from the non-Jew, like we don't have a right to exist, let alone to be successful and prosperous. And when we do, instead of admiration that, wow, look what you accomplished, there's anger and jealousy and hatred towards the Jew, because who are you to come here like as though we're, like I said, as though we're like usurping their rights or their home, right? And this is the Laban mentality. He looks at his son-in-law, the Jew, and he says, hey, I took you in. And that's what many countries have looked at the Jews, like, hey, we took you in when you were refugees, but we never thought you were going to become so successful. We never thought you were going to be so prosperous. And when you do get prosperous, we're jealous and angry and anti-Semitism. So Jacob's running away from his brother. So he goes to Laban. Laban takes him in. But then he works. First, he tries to trick him every which way. He works 7 years, another 7 years. And then you're going to see when he gives him a job as a shepherd, he tries to outsmart Jacob. But Jacob outsmarts him. And Jacob becomes successful. And now he's angry at Jacob for being so successful. And later at the Parsha, when he runs after Jacob, he says, the daughters are my daughters. The sheep are my sheep. Your money is my money. Everything is mine. Because he doesn't view the Jew as a human being. He views Jacob as his property. And Jacob has no right to anything. And everything belongs to him. You listen to Laban talk, you see he is the prototype of anti-Semites till today. And that's why the Haggadah, we say Jacob, meaning Laban, we say, wanted to uproot the entire Jewish nation. We don't just mean Mr. Laban in the Parsha. We mean the Labans in every generation who tried to uproot the Jewish people with the same arguments that Laban made, which is you don't have any rights to anything. You're lucky you even exist. You're lucky we let you in to our country. Meanwhile, they only took them in because they were opportunists. And why did Laban take Jacob in? He wasn't just a kind uncle. He was taking advantage. He said, I got this young kid. He's going to make me successful. He's going to work 7 years to marry my daughter free of charge. Then another 7 years to get the other daughter because I'll trick him into the wrong daughter. But then Jacob becomes successful on his own terms. And then he's angry about it. And so too, when the nations let us in, they take us in because they say, okay, the Jews are going to bring wealth, they're going to bring smarts, they're going to bring success. But then when we become prosperous like Laban, they become envious, angry, and they run after Jacob like Laban, literally trying to pursue him and kill him. And had God not intervened, who knows what would have happened to Jacob and his family. And that's why in the Haggadah we say that indeed Laban was worse than Pharaoh, if you could imagine that. Okay. Continuing on in this week's Torah portion, there's a very powerful, there's this concept, I think in English they say tit for tat, right? But in Hebrew we have a term for it. It says, Midah keneged midah. By the way, I just remember the rabbi who said the metaphor with the fish was Rabbi Dessler. He wrote a book called Michtav Eliyahu, and he uses that metaphor with selfish love versus altruistic love, which today we would say obsession versus, there's love and lust. Love and lust are not just different, they're opposites. Lust is about me, about taking. Love is about someone else, it's about giving. So never confuse the two. But going back to the story, so what happens? And this is a very, very painful story in a way. Leah's forced by her father to marry Jacob, but Jacob never wanted to marry Leah. So he's in a marriage that he didn't want to be in. And Rachel is now marries Jacob as well. And the Torah says that Jacob's love and affection was for Rachel, not for Leah. And Leah felt unloved in the marriage. So, and it's not that, and actually the verse says something much stronger. It says that she was hated. Now, it's not that Jacob hated her, but she felt hated. You see, there's how you feel towards someone and how they perceive how you feel towards them. So you may not hate somebody, but they could feel hated because they're very vulnerable, they're very fragile, they are sensitive, and so on and so forth. So you always have to take into account not just how you feel, but how the other person is feeling as a result. So what happens? It says that God saw, this week's Torah portion says, God saw that Leah was the unloved wife. So God blesses Leah with a child, Reuven. Now, right away you see here, that God always roots for the underdog. Leah is the underdog, meaning that she's the unloved wife. And God has compassion for those who are vulnerable, those who are, having challenges. And God sees that Leah is struggling in her marriage. So God blesses her with a child, some form of compensation. And Leah is really excited. She says, okay, now God saw my plight. Reuven, she names the baby Reuven. God saw and gave me a child. And she says, now my husband will start loving me because I'm the mother of his child. I made him a father. But unfortunately, nothing changes in the marriage. And now she has a second child. God sees again and gives her a second child. And there she says, Shimon, God has heard my plight and given me a child. And then the marriage doesn't improve again. And then a third child, Levi, she names him Levi, he'll attach himself to me. And unfortunately, the marriage doesn't improve. But meanwhile, Rachel can't have children. And Rachel is very sad and very distraught and bitter that she doesn't have a child. And in the Parsha, she says to her husband, I'm just going to find the verse. She cries out to her husband in tremendous despair, and she says to Jacob, she says, I cannot go on living this way without having children. And she says, what is the point of my life if I can't have children? And Jacob responds to Rachel and says, am I in the place of God? Hatachat Elokim ani. Am I in the place of God? Hashem mana mimech pri batan, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb. Meaning, why are you crying to me? I'm not the one who's not giving you children. Why are you upset at me, so to speak? And our rabbis tell us that this was very insensitive of Jacob. You know, his wife was clearly in distress and pain that she couldn't have children. And when she cries out to her husband says, what do you want from me? I'm not in the place of God. I'm not the one withholding your children. If you want to see the verse inside, it's chapter 30. It says, Rachel saw that she couldn't have children to Jacob, and she was jealous of her sister Leah, who had children. And she says to Jacob, Havali banim, give me children. Vim ayin meisanoch, if not, I'm dead. My life is worthless. And then it says, Vayicharaf Yaakov Rachel. Jacob gets angry at Rachel for talking this way. And he says, am I in the place of God who withheld the fruit of your womb? What do you want from me? And rabbis say that this wasn't the right response of a husband to a wife who's clearly speaking in anguish and pain. And here we find something amazing. Later on in the story, when I say later on, I mean the end of the book of Bereshit, we all know what's going to happen. Rachel's going to eventually have two children, Joseph and Benjamin, Yosef and Benjamin. And Yosef is eventually going to be sold into slavery by his brothers, thrown in the pit, sold into slavery, become the viceroy of Egypt. And then the brothers are going to come to Egypt, and he's going to recognize them. They're not going to recognize him, and he's going to do this whole charade with the food and the slave. And then eventually he's going to say, I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold into slavery. And they're going to be so embarrassed. And then he's going to console his brothers. And listen to what he says to his brothers later on at the end of Bereshit. He says, who am I to be angry at you and to punish you or to judge you? Hatachat Elokim ani. Am I in the place of God? Meaning I'm not God. Who am I to judge? So don't worry, I'm not going to seek any revenge. Now listen, the same words, am I in the place of God? Jacob uses it in the sense of, am I in the place of God that you don't have children? What do you want from me? Stop crying to me. Joseph uses it on the opposite, not to get angry at someone, but to comfort and console someone. He says to his brothers, am I in the place of God? Meaning I'm not God, so who am I to judge you? I have no anger towards you. I have no hatred towards you. So what happened? Rabbis say the children of Jacob, meaning the 10 tribes, had to fall before Joseph and go through that whole ordeal as a punishment for the way he spoke to his wife. And then Joseph comes and teaches, so to speak, us how to use the words. Am I in the place of God should be used the way Joseph used these words, to say to his brothers, listen, I have no ill will towards you because I'm not a God. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to condemn. I'm not here to take revenge, God, because that's God's department, not my department. So it's just a fascinating twist on these words and how Jacob employs them versus how Joseph uses them properly eventually. We only have a few minutes to just one last point on this week's Torah portion. And that is, there's a very important lesson our rabbis derive. We know that speech has a power unto itself. You know, this is something that in our society, time and again, we overlook it because people devaluate words. They're like, words don't matter, words don't count. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never, words are cheap, all of that. But we know in Judaism just the opposite, that words are extremely significant, sacred, and we should be very careful the way we use our words. Words can hurt tremendously, and words can heal. And the power of the word is to There's something called verbal abuse. You could abuse somebody with words. And on the other hand, words could be used to comfort, to bond. The way we connect with each other is through words. That's the way we build bridges between our hearts and connect with each other, understand each other. So man is in the image of God. We became speaking creatures, something other creatures cannot do, communicate with one another. And communications at an all-time high today because of technology, right? So I don't even know how many texts and messages and WhatsApps. Every minute is, it's probably, billions of communications flying around the world from people to each other. So whether we're speaking the words or texting the words or emailing the words are extremely, extremely powerful. And sadly, many relationships are destroyed over words, and many relationships are created over words. It all depends how the words are utilized. So we know the power of words, but we know that the more righteous a person is, the more accountable they are for their words and more careful they have to be with their words. There's a joke. It's not so funny, but it brings out the point. This guy was like, this guy wasn't so sane, I guess. He was asking people, what time is it? And then he said, I can't take it anymore. They said, what's the matter? He said, everyone I ask gives me a different answer, right? So the idea is that words are very important. And I want my father that there was a certain person who, if he would come inside and it was raining outside and somebody'd say, is it raining outside? He wouldn't say yes, because maybe it stopped raining since he got inside. So he would say, when I was outside, it was raining. The point is that you have to be very careful with your words in terms of truth, in terms of saying things that are not speaking gossip, not speaking negative about others, and more importantly, to never offend or insult somebody with your words, and never think, oh, it's just words. So what do we find in this week's Torah portion? When Jacob flees from his father-in-law's house, he takes his wives. He says, listen, we got to pack up and go. Now, at this point, Rachel and Leah are married to Jacob. They're following the monotheistic faith of Jacob, who learned it from Isaac, who learned it from Abraham. But as they leave, Rachel decides to steal her father's statues. Her father was an idol worshiper. He had idols in the house. She didn't want her father worshiping idols, so she takes it and she hides it underneath one of the pillows or one of the cushions in the camels. And when Laban runs after Jacob and his daughters and his grandchildren, and he says, Jacob, why did you leave in the middle of the night? You didn't tell me you're going. I couldn't say goodbye to my family. What did you do? And then he says to Jacob, and why did you steal my gods? He stole my idols, because he realized those idols were missing in the morning. Now, Jacob didn't know that Rachel had taken them from her father's house. So Jacob says the following. He says, I did not steal your gods. That's a false accusation, he says. And he says, you could search all of my possessions, all of my belongings. And then he takes it one step further. He says, whoever you find stole your gods, if anyone stole your gods, that person should not live. Now, when he came to search where Rachel was sitting, Rachel said, I'm having my monthly, my menstrual cycle. I can't really get up. I'm having cramps. I'm having pain. So he passed her up and she was able to hide it. So he never discovered the idols. But our rabbis say that because Jacob uttered those words, whoever stole the God should not live. That's why Rachel died prematurely. We all know that Rachel died in labor while she was giving birth to Benjamin in next week's Torah portion. And why did she die prematurely? Because of the curse or the words of Jacob that whoever stole the God shall die, even though it was unintentional. He had no idea that his wife, his beloved wife, Rachel, stole it. But because a righteous person uttered those words, they took effect at some point, and she died prematurely. immediately, but prematurely. Rabbi said it shows you how careful you have to be with your words because of the power of words, even when they're unintended or said without any malice or any ill will. Just the fact that he uttered these words, it came true on some level. So, a lot of times you hear people say, "I'm going to kill him," I can't believe you did. I'm going to kill the guy, or other things like that. And, it's just an expression. I'm going to kill him, or other expressions like, "Oh, let him drop dead." I don't really mean he should drop dead, right? But you shouldn't even utter such words. You have to be careful the type of words you use, and on every level, whether it's about being truthful and honest, whether it's about not using negative language, not using profanity, not saying extreme things, even if you don't mean it. Words have a life unto their own, a power unto their own. And not in the negative sense, but in the positive sense. When we say good things about people, when we say positive words, they generate and they trigger positive results and effects. So prayer is a great example of how our words have effect, not just in the heavens, but on us. When we hear the words of our own prayers, and we hear our mouths say all the wonderful things that the prayers say, it has an effect on us. So prayer has an effect on God, and he answers our prayers, but it also it changes us when we speak those words. And that's one of the benefits of prayers, that it not only changes our thinking and our mindset, and we talked before about focusing on God rather than ourselves, but when we express words of gratitude and kindness and love, and we say the Shema, you shall love Hashem with all your heart, with all your might, just uttering those words take on a power unto itself, and has positive effects and changes on our environment and everyone around us. So just a very powerful lesson about utilizing words properly and never using words in a way that is harmful. Words should be like a glue that brings people together, never something that separates and creates pain or discord or hurt. And another great example of that in the story of Jacob. So wishing everyone a great day. Let me see if there's any questions. Like Sarah, who gave Hagar to Abraham, Rachel in desperation gives Bilhah to Jacob. Correct. So Nira is absolutely right. Just like when Sarah couldn't have children, she said to Abraham, conceive a child through Hagar, and then it'll be like my child. That's what happens with Rachel as well. And then Leah as well, when she couldn't have children, she gives her handmaid, Zilpah. And that's how we end up with the 12 tribes of Israel from these 4 different wives that they have children, but they're considered the children of Rachel and Leah because the handmaids were considered an extension of the mothers. Each mother got a handmaid when she got married from her father Laban. Bilhah and Zilpah were the 2 handmaids. It's called Shivcha in the Torah. English, they call it a handmaid, I think. But they're considered all the children of the matriarchs because they are the extension of them. So wish everyone a great day and look forward to seeing everyone either by Lunch and Learn tomorrow or in Shabbat and Shul or any other time soon. Thank you all for joining and have a wonderful day. Take care.